Crossovers. They've become an increasingly common occurrence across many different forms of media. In general, they tend to be pretty awesome. Some people don't like them too much. I believe a common complaint is that the original source material can be sort of ruined during the crossover. It's not an opinion I entirely agree with, but I get where they're coming from. For me personally, I just love that you get to create dream scenarios that ordinarily could never exist, and overall, crossovers are just really cool to me. Today, the crossover I'll be talking about is Stranger Things and Dead by Daylight. I've talked about a few of DBD's licensed characters before, and while DBD just about always gets it right with their licenses, I really want to talk about Stranger Things and explain why I think it's DBD's best crossover. So, what is Stranger Things? It's a Netflix original TV series that aired in 2016. A bit of horror, a bit of mystery, and a whole lot of 80s nostalgia. That's the best way I could describe it. An interesting thing I've noticed is that Stranger Things isn't at all afraid to throw their brand into just about anything. It has crossover events with many different properties. Going back to what we were saying earlier, Stranger Things is sort of a prime example of crossovers that don't fully work for a lot of people. Some of them are rather unfaithful to the source material, or in some cases the source material is handled well but just isn't a good fit for the new media it appears in. And then they decided to license it to Dead by Daylight. This really feels like a match made in heaven. People have been asking for the world of Stranger Things to make an appearance in the game for a long time. After all, DBD launched just about a month before Stranger Things' first season. It certainly took a while, but after a couple hints from Netflix, which were really obvious in retrospect, Stranger Things appeared, and man, did they do it justice. Stranger Things was a chapter of firsts in many ways. I haven't even mentioned the actual killer associated with this chapter, that of course being the Demogorgon. I've always been a huge supporter of monster-type characters making their way into DBD, plus the Demogorgon honestly feels like such a perfect pick to represent the show. It's a mysterious, alien-like creature from another dimension. You can't really ask for anything more Stranger Things than that. So yeah, this chapter added our first monster killer. We haven't gotten a true monster killer since, but I really hope that the Demogorgon might have opened up that door sometime down the line. Another first for this chapter was featuring 2 survivors instead of only 1. Again, another amazing decision from all parties involved. It wouldn't have felt right to only grab 1 survivor from the Stranger Things universe, especially with a leading cast this big, and one with so many memorable faces to pick from. They decided to go with Nancy Wheeler and Steve Harrington. Yet again, I have nothing but praise for this decision. These characters feel perfect to represent the franchise, Nancy reflecting the more serious, ominous side of the story, and Steve reflecting the carefree, lighthearted parts of the show that became a lot more commonplace in the 3rd season. Jonathan Byers even makes an appearance as a legendary skin for Steve. I personally would have loved to see Chief Hopper since he's one of my personal favorites from the show. Robin would have been an excellent choice if they wanted another female too. Unfortunately, these characters will never make their way into the game, due to the current state of Netflix's deal with DBD. I haven't mentioned this so far, but the Stranger Things chapter will soon be completely taken off the DBD store. November 17th to be exact, so very soon. Most of the content will remain in the game for anybody that purchased it previously, outside of the chapter's associated map. More on that later. But new players will have no way to buy these characters. It's a lot of the reason I decided to cover the chapter at this time, seeing as the content will be taken off the store not long after this video releases. I'll talk more about all of this later, but I wanted to at least explain it right now to give some context for some of my thoughts. Oh man, do I have a lot to say about the Demogorgon. Let's start off with a bit of background, or rather, the lack thereof. Right away, we see one of the most interesting parts about featuring a monster instead of a human. The Demogorgon doesn't really have much of a story, it's basically an animal. This is true in its source material too. The Demogorgon is a mysterious creature with little actually known about it. I'm really glad Behavior was able to keep this level of mystery present, although to be fair, I imagine Netflix had a lot of influence over each character's lore bios for DBD. After all, Demos is just basically a physical description of the creature, little more. I'm glad they went this route though. Fully exposing the Demogorgon's inner workings would ruin a lot of the mystery that is essential to the monster's imposing presence. An admittedly strange part of said presence comes from the fact that it is basically an animal. DBD was sort of built on the idea of slashers with weapons hunting down survivors. The Demogorgon still hunts for sure, but it doesn't quite fill that slasher movie stereotype that is expected with DBD. To be honest, I appreciate the uniqueness Demo brings. I'll talk a little more about this later when I touch on the aesthetic aspects of the Demogorgon, but I wanted to at least mention it right now. Now let's take a look at the Demogorgon's stats and its unique power. When it comes to stats, Demogorgon is quite standard. It moves at 115% movement speed and has the default 32 meter terror radius. The Demogorgon's power is Of the Abyss. Can I just say that name is amazing? Anyway, Of the Abyss can be split into two main parts, portals and shred. The Demogorgon starts each match with 6 available portals which can be placed almost anywhere in the trial grounds. They effectively act like two-way tunnels, allowing the Demogorgon to travel between them once they are set up. In doing so, the Demogorgon traverses through the Upside Down, letting out a global noise that lets the survivors know what's happening. The Demogorgon receives the undetectable status for 3 seconds after coming out of a portal, allowing it to get a small head start in sneaking up on survivors. Survivors can't see these portals until they're activated, but once the Demogorgon travels between 2 portals, they are both activated. Survivors can then choose to seal these portals, although this is risky for a couple reasons. Survivors standing near portals suffer from the Oblivious status effect, so they might not hear the Demogorgon approaching until it's almost too late. Plus, the Demogorgon sees the Killer Instinct effect on survivors near portals, giving it some crucial information. The next part of Demo's power is Shred. While Demogorgon's portals are primarily used for mobility and information, Shred is a deadly attack when chasing survivors. After a slight charge up, the Demogorgon launches itself directly forward at an extremely high speed, covering a pretty large amount of ground in doing so. The Demogorgon's face thing opens up when performing this action, and it also emits a distinct sound effect, letting survivors know that they're in danger. Shred can also be used to break pallets faster. It even allows you to get some crazy airtime if used to launch off of a high structure. Demogorgon has a lot of tools to work with, and man, I love everything it brings to the game so much. Let's get right into my opinions on Demo. I'll be upfront with you, I have almost nothing but positive things to say about this guy. He just does so much right and so little wrong in my opinion. First off, the fun factor, arguably the most important part. Portals almost entirely get rid of that feeling of having to trudge your way around the map. Being able to place them anywhere allows a lot of creativity and expression from your side. The tug-of-war style gameplay they bring between killer and survivor is also quite engaging. It's awesome sticking yourself in a dangerous situation to try to remove one of Demo's portals, and it feels equally rewarding as Demogorgon to get the drop on someone trying to destroy your precious work. Portals are great and all, but where Demo really shines for me is with Shred. When it comes to chases, this is one of the most balanced attacks in the entire game. It's right up there with Hillbilly's Chainsaw. Shred requires a surprisingly high amount of precision and timing to use effectively, and I'd argue an equal effort is required from survivors to counter Shred. Shred lets the Demogorgon move insanely fast for a brief second, yet it has a fair windup that allows survivors to react accordingly. I particularly love that barely charging Shred only gives you a much smaller lunge, while fully charging it gives an absolutely monstrous leap. I adore the visual and audio cues that come with it too. Demogorgon opening its mouth is such a perfect way to let even an inexperienced player know that they're in trouble. The associated sound effect is perfect too. Sure, it gives survivors a bit of an edge if the Demogorgon isn't in their line of sight, but if anything, that just makes them a really fair design. You can also use this sound cue to scare survivors. I particularly love doing it on this spot at the Killer Shack. Demogorgon can use Shred to zone survivors away from pallets or windows, which, if you look at many other killer designs, is a rather touchy subject. I'm not sure why, maybe it's just my inherent bias towards this killer, but I feel like Demogorgon handles this way better than most of the others. He moves at a pretty fair reduced speed while holding Shred, and if you decide to cancel Shred, there's a lengthy enough cooldown that you actually feel sort of punished. You can also punish Demogorgons that like to hold Shreds to break pallets. Many demos will respect pallets pretty hard, expecting an insta-throw, so you can take advantage of this by running through it and looping another time. Missing a Shred can also be pretty rough. There's a fairly lengthy cooldown that allows some distance to be made. I just absolutely love everything about what Shred brings to chases. It's dynamic, skill-based, and feels fair in just about every scenario. Breaking pallets faster feels so smooth, and my god, there really isn't a feeling like hitting a max range Shred. I believe these traits apply to both sides too. I absolutely love playing as Demogorgon, and find it equally amazing to face the creature. As I've mentioned, there's a perfectly reasonable amount of counterplay from the survivor's end, so it feels so rewarding to know that you played well against somebody that could actually react to you. Interaction between survivors and killers in a chase is really what makes DBD so fun, so having a power as unique and fair as Demogorgon's feels so great for everyone. Shred feels like one of the most finely tuned abilities in the entire game. All of the numbers on it feel absolutely perfect. If they were to change even a little bit in either direction, it just wouldn't feel the same. Speaking of that, I'm incredibly happy with where Demogorgon's balance is. Demogorgon is undeniably strong, but its strength feels just about perfect. The Demogorgon's kit is quite well rounded, but the versatility of its power allows it to tackle a wide variety of situations. Demogorgon doesn't necessarily exceed crazily in one area, but rather is really solid at just about everything. Portals provide the Demogorgon with some solid map pressure, although it isn't quite as good as something like the Blights. Likewise, Shred is an amazing chasing tool, although it certainly doesn't compare to some of the best chasing powers such as the Nurse. Still, Demogorgon ends up being a really solid all-rounder. I guess the good news is Demo's balance is unlikely to ever change due to the licensing situation with Stranger Things, and I couldn't be happier with how it ended up. To touch a little more on balance, I'm still always surprised to see people saying they think Demogorgon is a terrible killer. I'll give my classic disclaimer and say that I don't think Demogorgon is top tier, but it still feels like people don't take full advantage of the tools of the Abyss provides. I'd argue one of the big areas people seem to mess up in is with portals. Some people don't use them nearly enough, and some people waste the entire match trying to set their network up. There is certainly a fine line that I think people struggle to find, but if you can find it, portals are so effective at maintaining map pressure. Sometimes you can choose to hide your portals if you want to sneak up on survivors after traversing the Upside Down, or you can choose to place portals right on objectives as a way to slow survivors down. They'll no doubt want to seal any portals near objectives, so you basically get to stall time without having to invest too much. You'd be surprised how useful the information aspect of them can be. It's always a pleasant surprise when a well-placed portal works in your favor. Another amazing place to set portals is near exit gates. A lot of people don't seem to know this, but you can place portals close enough to exit gates so that you still get the tracking from them. This allows you to effectively checkmate a survivor if they're the last one in the match, since there's literally no way they can actually escape. One other thing is that I've seen people saying that portals are worthless as a stealth option due to how loud the Demogorgon's footsteps and passive noises are. To be honest, it's not entirely untrue, but I feel like people misunderstand the intended use here. Demo isn't supposed to be some stealth master, after all it's a giant hulking creature. It's not exactly going to be quiet. The 3 seconds of undetectable after exiting a portal are there so that Demogorgon's approach isn't extremely obvious, not so that you can literally always sneak up on survivors. Speaking of that, now would be a good time to move into a new section I'm going to include in these videos. That being a small part where I give my suggestions on what could change about a killer. Admittedly, I probably picked the worst killer to start this on, since I think Demogorgon is damn near perfect and needs little changes. That being said, nothing is truly perfect, so I've got a couple ideas. Going right back to the portal discussion I was just having, I think there'd be a good way to improve portals for those that want to use them for stealth. I think it'd be really nice if the Demogorgon's footsteps were silenced for the duration of the undetectable status after emerging from a portal. This would make sneaking up on survivors a tiny bit easier, but there would still be room for counterplay from survivors, since the Demogorgon makes a lot of noise, even while just existing. This buff would also make some of Demo's add-ons more appealing, since some of them increase the duration of the undetectable effect, which with this buff would also increase the duration of no footstep noise. Speaking of add-ons, that leads me right into my next buff suggestion. Demo already got a fairly recent add-on pass, but a large number of them are extremely underwhelming. Like, they're not even just bad, but honestly some of them are effectively useless. I'm not saying Demogorgon needs to have an entire set of S-tier add-ons, but I feel like you could do some really fun things with add-ons revolving around both parts of Demogorgon's power. One last suggestion I wanted to make here has to do with Shred. I absolutely love Shred, as I'm sure you know, but it has one thing that I've always found weird. That being that it almost entirely locks your camera during the animation after successfully landing a Shred. It's really not that big of a deal, but there's been rare situations where I've lost track of a survivor since I physically cannot move my camera enough to see where they went. Again, it's not a huge deal, and it doesn't come up super often, but at the same time, I think changing this would do no harm. Okay, I'm just gonna say this right now. The Stranger Things chapter is absolutely phenomenal in the aesthetic department. Steve and Nancy's models look much more accurate than most licensed characters. I would assume that this is partly because they actually got the rights to use the actors' faces this time around. Plus, I think they just generally did a really good job at capturing the feel of these two. In my opinion, Steve looks a little better than Nancy does. His model is pretty dang close to the original actor. Still, Nancy's looks quite good too. I wish they were able to get the actors to actually provide their voices for their own characters, but it seems like there's always some obstacle preventing this from happening. After all, Ash is the only character to actually be portrayed by his actor.
What now?
Both Steve's and Nancy's sound effects are alright, but they definitely sound a little off. Plus, in a recent patch, both of their voices were randomly pitched up, and I'll just say I'm really not a fan. I hope this isn't permanent, but seeing as the Day of Reckoning approaches ever quickly, I don't think this will ever be reverted. For cosmetics, all of the Stranger Things characters have a surprisingly large variety for licensed characters. Both Steve and Nancy have multiple outfits pulled right out of the show. I mean, heck, they even managed to get them ugly sweaters for Christmas. Steve also got a skin that turns him into Jonathan, which was an awesome way to include another character. Even the Demogorgon got to join in on the fun. The creature actually has a couple options to choose from, which is quite surprising. I mean, if you asked me, I'd have no clue how to design cosmetics for a monster that seemingly only has one visual appearance. That's a really cool part about Demo's cosmetics. Apparently Netflix was very open to DBD making their own interpretations, since all of the Demogorgon's outfits are entirely unique to DBD. They don't appear anywhere in the show. I know I haven't mentioned it, but the Demogorgon's model looks fantastic, by the way. Apparently Netflix already had a model from the show that the developers were given as a frame of reference, so it's based directly off how it appears in Stranger Things. Talking about the Demogorgon, I not only love facing it because of the chase mechanics, but Demo's imposing presence in a match feels so amazing. Many things went into making this creature work, and man, do they really work. First off, sound effects. Demogorgon's roars are absolutely incredible. You can hear the map wide, and the sound effects themselves quite literally scream raw power. What's interesting is these sound effects aren't featured anywhere in the show. If anything, DBD's version of Demogorgon feels turned up to 11, and I'm all for it. I have to wonder if Netflix provided these sounds, or if they're behavior's own interpretation. I honestly don't know, but if it is DBD's own work, they did a phenomenal job. Speaking of the map-wide sound effects, Demogorgon does so much aesthetically to really immerse you in a match. You never feel safe hearing constant noises in the distance. Plus, the sound effect when the Demogorgon traverses the Upside Down is incredible at creating tension. All of this culminates in the Demogorgon's terror radius and chase theme, which I find to be absolutely perfect. The distant ambience is eerie, but a little more subdued. Once the creature gets closer though, you start to feel the imminent danger. The Close By theme is so good at capturing the 80s feel the show was going for, and it also pushes the sci-fi aspects of the Demogorgon. We don't know much about this monster, but we know it's terrifying. And finally, the in-chase music. I mean, wow. It's the type of theme that probably wouldn't work for a human character, but fits so well for a creature like the Demogorgon. It's fast-paced, unpredictable, and fills you with such a rush. On the topic of music, that menu theme. How they managed to almost seamlessly combine DBD's main theme with that of Stranger Things is something I will never understand, but the end result is amazing. It captures the tone of the show in all of the right ways. Speaking of tone, portals also contribute amazingly to setting the mood of a match. Stealing them as a survivor gives you the slightest glimpse into the Upside Down, but nothing is ever fully revealed. The added ambient noise gives you a sense of an otherworldly presence, and the Oblivious status effect makes you never really feel safe during the encounter. They also fit the Demogorgon so well, since in a typical match, portals can cause the Demogorgon to seemingly come out of nowhere, just like in the show. Even with the sound cues, portals contribute amazingly to the Demogorgon's unpredictable, alien-like feel. I sometimes wonder what it would have been like if the Demogorgon had a system in which it dragged you into its world, the Upside Down. It'd look really cool visually, but I can't even begin to think how such a system could impact gameplay. And as we've already seen with Freddy, both in his new and old appearances, having alternate realms is a questionable choice that is really hard to design around. I've already mentioned this a bunch of times before, but I'm so pleased with how the Demogorgon provides visual feedback. It opening its mouth during the shred action is so perfect. I'd also like to talk about the Demogorgon's Mori. Here it is. It's pure, unrestrained violence. I kinda love it. In particular, the fact that the survivor's scream gets muffled once getting, chomped makes the whole situation even more horrible. In typical DBD fashion, it's weirdly tame, there's not any extreme gore or anything. Regardless, I'm still in love with the animation. Behavior knew how to capture the Demogorgon perfectly. Oh, and this is a little thing, but Demo's animation when vaulting a window is sick. One of the weirder parts of Demogorgon's transition into DBD is how it fits into the story of the entity's trials. It's a little hard to believe that the Demogorgon would willingly carry survivors to hooks. I can only imagine it literally mauling a survivor after downing them. I actually think there's a creative way to explain this though. The Demogorgon has been controlled before. I mean, after all, that's basically the entire plot of one of Stranger Things' seasons. We don't know much about the creature, but what we do know is that it's essentially part of the ecosystem of the Upside Down. It doesn't really have control over its own actions. I would assume that it fits in similarly in the entity's realm. The only thing that will always look a little silly to me is watching the Demogorgon carry survivors on its shoulder, but I can look past this for the sake of gameplay. More than anything, I appreciate the sense of uniqueness the Demogorgon brings to the game over any other killer. It's not some psychotic slasher or someone that has a reason to kill. It's simply an animal, nothing more. Overall, just about every aesthetic detail in the Stranger Things chapter is executed masterfully. The sound effects are perfect, the animations are on point, the models of all the characters are surprisingly faithful to the source material. Demogorgon is an example of a killer that creates such a unique atmosphere when facing it. It feels like I'm going up against a terrifying force far beyond my understanding. Pyramid Head is one of the few other examples of this for me in DBD, but I might even prefer Demo's aesthetic details over Pyramid Head's. We'll get to that when I eventually talk about Silent Hill, but that's a story for another day. Couple quick things before we look at perks. Firstly, I'll be using the perks' original names, not the new ones. Apparently, part of Netflix's deal with DBD included the names of the perks associated with this chapter, so they were all changed. I'll be going with the old names because they're more familiar to me, and they much better represent the character in question. I'm also going to include Steve and Nancy's character overviews here, for a reason that'll be obvious soon enough. Alright, let's get right to it. I have more perks to cover than usual since there were 2 survivors. Let's start with the Demogorgon's perks. Demo's first perk is Surge. Downing a survivor with a basic attack will cause all generators within 32 meters to explode and start regressing, the explosion causing an instant 8% loss of progress. Surge also has a cooldown of 40 seconds. It's actually kind of nice. Certainly not the best slowdown perk in the game by any means, but I actually really enjoy the passive nature of the perk. On smaller maps, it can be pretty effective, potentially causing 24% regression across the generators it affects. Admittedly, Pop can do the exact same thing much more consistently, plus Pop is a flat 25% each time it goes off. Yeah, Surge doesn't compare at all with the best regression perks, but I still enjoy it. I would prefer if it either didn't have a cooldown, or if it didn't have the restriction of basic attacks. But overall, I'd still say Surge is quite fun to use. Next up is Cruel Limits. When a generator is completed, all vaults within a 32 meter terror radius are blocked for 30 seconds. It's really bad. Like, I so badly want to say something good about Cruel Limits, but it has so little going for it. It can only activate a maximum of 5 times a match, and beyond that, a generator might be finished that has little or no windows near it, rendering the perk basically useless. That's not even mentioning the fact that you actually have to be near the completed generator to take advantage of the effect as a killer. I don't even know if this perk can be salvaged, but I thought up a couple ideas. The duration of the effect should probably be increased by a fairly substantial amount, possibly 45 seconds, or even having the total duration be a full minute. I'd also like to see the perk block pallets in addition to windows. I'm guessing it didn't have that effect because pallets couldn't be blocked by any perks at that time, But we now have Hex Blood Favor, so there really isn't any excuse to not just implement the same mechanics onto Cruel Limits. As I said before, this perk is extremely underwhelming. Run it if you want to tank your MMR. Demo's last perk is Mindbreaker. Any survivors working on generators are affected by both the exhausted and blindness status effects. These effects linger for 5 seconds after the survivor stops the repair. I have always had a soft spot for Mindbreaker. I'm not going to argue that it's top tier or anything, but I think it's genuinely pretty alright on both stealth killers and killers that have high mobility. You can take advantage of the exhausted status as both of these types of killers, plus the newly added blindness is a weirdly amazing counter to Kindred. Kindred provides a lot of info to survivor teams when one of their teammates is hooked, but the blindness provided by Mindbreaker sort of perfectly counters it. Mindbreaker also has some weirdly good synergy with Blood Echo. Blood Echo provides a lot of exhaustion, so the admittedly tiny 5-second duration of Mindbreaker is made up for quite a bit with the much longer duration that Blood Echo has. To wrap things up with Mindbreaker, I actually think it's relatively underrated. I'll reiterate that I don't think it's a top tier perk or anything, but it's slept on a little more than I think it should be. Demogorgon's perks relate to its own powers in the show surprisingly well. One of the Demogorgon's main traits is that it causes electricity to go crazy in its presence, which I think is reflected quite well in its perks. All three have to do with generator repairs, plus I imagine Cruel Limits blocking things might be a way to show the Upside Down's influence. This might be a bit of a stretch, but I'd also like to believe that Surge is a direct reference to a scene from the show, in which Joyce receives a phone call but is shocked by the phone due to the Demogorgon's electronic interference. It's the little things, but I really appreciate the way its behavior tries to accurately reflect these characters through their perks, even something as out there as the Demogorgon. For the survivors, I'll start with Nancy. Her first perk is Better Together. While repairing a generator, its aura is revealed in yellow for any teammates within 32 meters of your location. When any survivor is downed while you're repairing a generator, you see all other survivors' auras for 10 seconds. It's cute, but not particularly amazing. Splitting up is generally much more effective than working together due to the time efficiency, so weirdly enough, this perk encourages you to play in a worse fashion. I guess it's not all bad if you have Proved Thyself, an amazing gen repair perk that can make up for the penalty of working with others. The aura reading on other survivors is also kinda neat. It's actually not too bad for solo play. Reminds me a lot of Kindred, weirdly enough. Overall though, this perk is still extremely underwhelming. There are much better info perks you can run for yourself, so the only real benefit, if you can even call it that, is that teammates can see which generators you are actively repairing. A bit of a dud, unfortunately. Nancy's next perk is Fixated. You walk 20% faster and can see your own scratch marks. Incredibly simple, yet surprisingly effective. This is everything Urban Evasion should have been. The faster walking speed is nice if you're running any exhaustion perks, plus being able to see your own scratch marks is actually really cool. It allows you to plan out your route a little more effectively since you can see what the killer is seeing from your trail. It's another perk that isn't the absolute best thing ever, but is genuinely quite solid in certain builds. I'd recommend this one for sure if you enjoy the different sort of playstyle it brings out. Nancy's last perk is Inner Strength. After cleansing any totem, you can hide in a locker, which will heal a full health state after 8 seconds. It's pretty much a way better version of self-care. The time invested in it actually isn't awful since you're doing totems, which can either help in stopping Noed, or even just help you find any hexes that the killer might have. Up until recently, I'd only have positive things to say about Inner Strength, but a recent addition to the game kind of killed a lot of its viability in my opinion. Boon totems are a fairly new mechanic right now. They're basically like hex perks but for survivors. In general, survivor teams now want to leave totems up so that they can apply boons to the totems instead of destroying them. Do you see where I'm going with this? Inner Strength is basically the antithesis of boons. It wants you to break totems, which admittedly before boons were introduced was quite good, but now using Inner Strength and breaking a bunch of totems is kind of throwing for your team. I suppose if your team has no boon perks equipped, it's just like before, but as it stands right now, boons seem to have cemented themselves as a really good meta perks. Inner Strength certainly isn't bad, it really just depends on what types of perks your teammates are running. If you can coordinate and survive with friends, you might be able to make Inner Strength work a little better, but otherwise it unfortunately directly contradicts what is basically the meta right now. Lastly, we've got Steve's perks. Steve's first perk is Babysitter. When you unhook a survivor, that survivor will leave no scratch marks or blood trails. Plus, they also get a 7% movement speed bonus for 8 seconds. Babysitter also reveals the killer's aura to you for 8 seconds. This perk is sort of hilarious, it's perfect for Steve. Both from the name to the actual effect, it's all about protecting your teammates and putting yourself in harm's way. Running Babysitter used to also reveal your own aura to the killer, but this was patched out with a recent buff. It absolutely made the perk better, but it was honestly so funny because that reminded me even more of Steve. Intentionally showing himself to the murderer is absolutely something he'd do. When it comes to the actual gameplay part of Babysitter, borrowed time exists. That's all I really have to say. Like, borrowed time is the unhooking perk for survivors, and it probably always will be. I guess you could run Babysitter in addition to borrowed time, but it's not really going to help out that much. I really want to like Babysitter since it's thematically amazing, but its effect is frustratingly underwhelming. Steve's next perk is Camaraderie. While in the struggle phase of being hooked, if another survivor comes within 16 meters of the hook, your sacrifice timer is paused for 34 seconds. It's extremely underrated in so many ways. I really think Camaraderie is so much better than people give it credit for. It's a genuine lifesaver in certain situations, allowing your team more time to plan out a hook rescue. It can even help you waste more of the killer's time if they decide to face camp. 34 seconds is a pretty long time in a DBD match. I understand why people don't like to run it. In a lot of games it probably won't do anything at all to actually help you. But oh man, if you do get in one of those rare situations where it does go off, Camaraderie can be absolutely vital in escaping. Steve's last perk is Second Wind. Healing another survivor for one full health state activates Second Wind. The next time you are unhooked, you become broken for 20 seconds, but once those 20 seconds are up, you instantly heal one health state. Like Camaraderie, I think people sleep on this one way more than they should. The most annoying part about it is 100% the activation requirement. Being exactly one health state makes it oddly annoying to activate at times. Still, if you can get around that, Second Wind does so much for you and your team after an unhook. Not having to heal saves a ton of time. You can immediately jump back on a generator. It's also really nice if the killer decides to tunnel you straight off the hook. If you can last for 20 seconds, insta-healing in the killer's face is both satisfying and amazing for the state of the match. It's great in an endgame situation too when you need to make a tight escape. I really like Second Wind. In my opinion, it's a lot better than people give it credit for. To wrap up with perks, I want to again reiterate how amazing all these perks represent the characters they are based on. Nancy's perks are serious and practical. They help get the job done in an efficient manner. Inner Strength plays into her pseudo-detective role that she takes on in the show without treading too much on the ground laid out by the similarly named Detective's Hunch. These traits perfectly reflect Nancy's serious nature within Stranger Things. On the complete polar opposite are Steve's perks. They're goofy, unconventional. I mean seriously, 2 of the 3 require you to get your ass kicked to activate them, and the other one is all about throwing yourself in harm's way. Despite their unimpressive exterior, they can come through in the end, allowing both you and your friends to make daring escapes. They're absurd yet useful, just like the main man Steve. I'll comment that strength-wise, this chapter didn't have any perks that were entirely meta-defining or anything, but I still think there's some fun options from the set we got here. They're the types of perks that aren't useful all the time, but occasionally surprise you with a sudden burst of value. Ugh, where do I even start? I've spent so long singing the praises of the Stranger Things chapter, but its map is by far the weakest aspect of the entire chapter in my eyes. It takes place in the Hawkins National Laboratory, a place that was extremely important in the first 2 seasons of the show. There's definitely been discussion about which areas could have been picked to be represented in DBD. In particular, the Starcourt Mall from the 3rd season would have been a really unique pick, although logistically it would have been a nightmare to design, I imagine. And so we ended up with Hawkins National Laboratory, which I will shorten to just Hawkins going forward. Currently, it is one of 5 indoor maps in the game, which as always I have to bring up that indoor maps are really controversial for gameplay. Everybody has their own opinion on the matter, but I definitely think that most of them provide subpar gameplay compared to the normal maps. In my opinion, this isn't really because of the fact that the maps are indoor, but rather that they have really awkward layouts or change up the map's flow drastically to the point that chases are really unfun for both sides. Hawkins without question falls into that latter point. It actually doesn't have a completely awful layout. I mean, all things considered, it's weirdly consistent in some ways. The problem, of course, is the way that chases play out. Hawkins decides to give survivors a ton of pallets to work with, but nearly all of these pallets are absolutely terrible. As a result, you'll eventually be forced to drop a pallet as a survivor, and then attempt to play some really unsafe 50-50s. For Killer, these types of pallets have the exact same gameplay every single time. You usually hard respect the pallet until it's dropped, and then fake the survivor out and secure a hit with a basic attack. Keep in mind what I just said, basic attack. You pretty much have to go for lunges on this map. So many killers struggle to use their powers around Hawkins' pallets because they're so short that you basically can't a lot of the time. Oh, and that's another bizarre part of the balance of Hawkins. Nearly all the pallets are almost unusable, yet there's a few that are insanely good, so it ends up being really awkward. Not to mention, some of those god pallets are RNG spawns, so you can't even really rely on that. Mobility killers mostly can't even use their powers to get around the map. It's absurdly tight. That's another one of its big flaws. Even by indoor map standards, this map is compressed. Like, I feel so claustrophobic. There's tons of tiny choke points and the walls are never particularly far apart. Another big issue this map has is that 2 of the gens are effectively worthless to the killer since they're really time consuming to patrol. One of these is in the upstairs lab area of the map. You have to go up a staircase to a completely different floor. Yes, Hawkins technically has 2 floors. And while it can be really good if you catch a survivor out here, it still feels like a big waste of time. This top floor area is yet another design flaw of Hawkins. Outside of the generator, there's effectively nothing up here worth either side's time, other than the occasional totem or chest. As a result, not only is the generator not worth patrolling, but the entire area becomes useless to both sides once the gen is done. The other gen not worth looking at is on the opposite side of the map in the portal room. It basically has the exact same issue. It's elevated and your approach is pretty obvious even if you're a stealth killer. I guess that's the one advantage of the other gen I just talked about. At least that generator has very low visibility for survivors, so it can be a little risky to do. Another aspect of generators this map fails on is indications letting survivors know where gens are located. Larry's has some really obvious signs that flicker in rooms with generators. The meat plant has sliding doors that always indicate a gen. Even RPD has flickering light bulbs. Hawkins does have sliding doors that open once a gen is completed, similarly to the meat plant, but unlike that map, these doors don't always indicate a generator's presence. It's probably the worst indoor map for finding gens besides Midwich. When it comes to aesthetics, like with the rest of the Stranger Things chapter, this map absolutely nails it. It's a fairly old map at this point. Wow, that feels weird to say. But visually it looks really good. I love that you start to see particles in the air as you get closer to the giant upside down portal. Plus the ambient noise does an excellent job at showing off the upside down's immense power. Sound is something Hawkins handles amazingly in general. There's so many noises going on all at once, yet that's exactly what I'd imagine for a lab like this. There's even a cage of rats in the upstairs area, plus the rats make an appearance on the map's hooks, an obvious reference to the 3rd season of the show. Speaking of that upstairs area, while I ragged on it for its gameplay, it's kind of awesome aesthetically. The entire area is pretty much taken one-to-one from the show, even down to the disturbing isolation room. Fittingly, it's a one-man generator, and it somehow even feels claustrophobic despite the fact that the door is open. You can even see the crack in the wall where 11 threw the security guard. Speaking of 11, they even managed to include the isolation tanks, which make for unique drop-down locations in some of the map's rooms. The portal room and the area outside it are also lovingly recreated. As I said with the upstairs area, these are taken directly from the show. Even the exit gates are references. They have a unique appearance, which at the time was not the norm. And they even open like the elevators do in Stranger Things. You know, I guess to be entirely fair, this map does in fact nail the feel of what it would actually be like to be in the Hawkins lab from the show. It's claustrophobic, confusing, and downright weird.
The lab is a character in that series. It's really a place that's oppressive, that's scary, that puts people in an uncomfortable place. When we created that level, and when you're running around that level, and you're running around with these characters, and you're being chased by the Demogorgon, you feel like you're playing a Stranger Things game.
Bottom line, this map nails its aesthetics. Unfortunately, its aesthetics simply cannot carry it. The gameplay of Hawkins is so frustratingly bad for both sides that I can't look past it, even if there are a plethora of amazing decisions in the aesthetic department. This map will actually be leaving the game soon, a detail I've yet to mention. You know by now that the Stranger Things chapter will soon not be available for purchase anymore, but if you own any of the characters, you can still use them going forward. The same cannot be said for Hawkins. I guess part of the deal with Netflix determined that this map would be removed if their deal would ever end. Since it's being removed very soon, I've seen a lot of people coming forward saying that they'll really miss this map, and this feels like a classic case of rose-tinted lenses. I mean, hey, you know what, if you like this map, fair enough. I'll just say that even though it's being removed, I'm not sad to see it go, simply because its gameplay doesn't vibe with me at all. If anything, I'm just sad that Behavior was never able to rework it into something I could love, since I'd really like Stranger Things to have an awesome, memorable map in DBD. Every other aspect of the chapter is near perfect in my eyes, so it's frustrating that the map is an obvious blemish on an otherwise amazing product. Well, regardless, goodbye, Hawkins National Laboratory. I wish I could say I'm sorry to see you go, but I'm not. Alright, it's finally time to tackle it. It's been mentioned multiple times throughout this video, but Stranger Things will be leaving the Dead by Daylight store on the 17th of November. The first question, why? We don't really know. There's only assumptions to be made, but the common theory right now is that Netflix is branching out into gaming, and views DBD as a potential competitor. As such, they pulled back on their deal with DBD. I'm thinking that, despite being a theory, this is very likely the actual reason as to why it happened. It's a sort of, well, silly reason, but I suppose it makes sense to them from a business standpoint. The next question, will Stranger Things ever return? Yet again, there's no way to really say for sure. I think it's certainly possible that maybe Netflix changes their mind much further down the line, but I can't see them coming back to DBD anytime soon. I mean, going back to another one of Stranger Things' crossovers, their event with Fortnite was rather small from what I understand, plus the skins that, actually represent the show haven't been seen in Fortnite's item shop for a very long time. Still, I'm so happy that Stranger Things was able to find a, well, permanent home in Dead by Daylight. Yes, the characters will no longer be available to be purchased, and the Hawkins map will be entirely removed. Despite that, Steve, Nancy, and the Demogorgon will continue to have a place in Dead by Daylight for those that have purchased them. I really do feel like Stranger Things was a huge milestone for the game. It's such a modern property and one that is incredibly popular. In some ways, I'd argue that it might have opened up the door for other modern franchises to make their way into the game. I'm still hoping that we might get another monster character, even if it's an original character from DBD. Having Demogorgon in the game is such a novelty and reminds me how awesome it is to have a playable character that isn't human in any way. Regardless, I'm sad to see Stranger Things get sort of lost to time, I guess. It's such a shame that new players will never be able to play as these characters. So let me just say right now that if you're watching this video right as it comes out, consider getting the Stranger Things chapter if you care at all about these characters. The Demogorgon is, in my opinion, an absolutely amazing design for a killer power, and both survivors provide their own flavor right out of the show. Their perks are in the general pool now, so anybody can get them, but just to recap on that, Stranger Things has a pretty cool set of perks. None of them are strong enough that they shook up how the game is played or anything, but there's undoubtedly some fun options for both sides. To reiterate on Hawkins, I'm sad to see a map go simply because it means we're losing a piece of content entirely, but I will readily admit that I never liked the gameplay of Hawkins, and probably never will. Still, Stranger Things has stood the test of time for me, and is my personal favorite of DBD's many crossover chapters. It managed to capture the tone of the show perfectly, sometimes a little too much, while also translating the characters of the show almost flawlessly to Dead by Daylight. All in all, thank you for the amazing memories, Stranger Things. I can't wait to make even more.
Every single thing that we've done so far with external partners has been absolutely mind-blowingly exciting. Everything we went for is the biggest ever, and now you have this game which contains almost all of the biggest icons in horror. And it means that, next chapters could be anything. There's absolutely nothing that's off the table there. Right now, there's nothing too big for us.